everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, Thinking in English. I'm Clara.
And I'm Leo. We're so excited you've joined us for episode 2, where we're diving into one of my absolute favorite topics, vocabulary building.
Yes, today we're talking all about building your English thinking vocabulary, because having the right words at your fingertips is absolutely crucial when you're trying to think directly in English.
Exactly. Last week, we introduced the concept of breaking free from the translation trap and the cognitive shift that happens when you start thinking in English. Today, we're getting practical about how to build up the word power you need.
I had a student email me after our last episode saying she was so inspired to start thinking in English, but she kept hitting vocabulary roadblocks. She'd be in the middle of a thought and then, poof, her mind would go blank because she was missing a key word.
That's such a common experience. I remember when I was learning Japanese, I'd be having this great internal monologue until I needed to think about something simple like doorknob or a ceiling fan, and suddenly I'd be completely stuck.
And then you're right back to translation mode. So today we're going to explore strategies for building a rich mental lexicon that enables fluid thinking without constantly needing to revert to your native language.
Let's start with what I think is a question on many people's minds. How many words do you actually need to think comfortably in English?
That's such a great place to start. You know, there's this fascinating research suggesting that knowing just 2,000 word families gives you about 80% coverage of everyday English texts and conversations.
Wait, what do you mean by word families?
Great question. A word family includes a base word plus all its inflected forms and derivations. So help, helps, helped, helping, helper, helpful, helpfully, helpfulness. Those would all count as one word family.
That makes the goal seem much more achievable. So with 2,000 word families, you've got enough for a basic thinking and communication.
Yes. But here's where it gets interesting. To really think comfortably without constantly hitting roadblocks, research suggests you need about 5,000 to 6,000 word families. That gives you roughly 90% coverage.
And I'm guessing that last 10% is what makes the difference between just getting by and actually feeling fluent.
Absolutely. For truly comfortable thinking in any context, including professional or academic settings, you're looking at 8,000 to 9,000 word families. But the good news is that you don't need to learn all the words at once.
Right. It's about the 80-20th rule. Focus on the most frequently used words first, and you'll get the biggest impact for your effort.
Exactly. And there's another important distinction to make between core vocabulary and specialized terminology. Core vocabulary is what you need regardless of your field or interests. Words like consider, develop, impact, resource that appear across contexts.
While specialized vocabulary would be field-specific terms like amortization for finance or photosynthesis for biology, you only need those if they're relevant to your life and goals.
And that's why I always encourage my students to prioritize. Get those 2,000 most common word families down first, then expand into the areas most relevant to your life. No point learning complex medical terminology if you work in marketing.
So we've talked about how many words you need, but I think how you organize those words in your mind is just as important. Would you agree, Clara?
100%. This is actually one of the biggest differences between beginners and advanced speakers, how they organize vocabulary in their minds.
I love thinking about this because it's something I noticed in my own language learning. When I started with Japanese, I had these isolated word lists, but they weren't connected to each other in my mind.
Yes, that's such a common approach, learning words in isolation, but native speakers don't organize vocabulary as a giant alphabetical list. We have what linguists call semantic networks, words connected by meaning, association, and usage.
Can you give an example of what a semantic network might look like?
Sure, think about the word coffee. In a native speaker's mind, that's connected to brew, grounds, caffeine, mug, morning, espresso, barista, roast, all these related concepts. When they think coffee, this whole network activates.
That's so true. And I bet those connections make recall faster and more natural. Plus, when you think in concept clusters, you're more likely to grab the right word for the specific context.
Exactly. And here's a practical tip for our listeners. Instead of making vocabulary lists by alphabet or category, try creating mind maps with related words. Put a central concept in the middle, then branch out with all connected words and phrases.
I love that approach. And you can keep expanding those maps as you learn more words. It really mirrors how our brains naturally organize language.
Another approach is to create scenario based word collections. So instead of learning random food words, you'd learn all the vocabulary you might need at a restaurant, from making reservations to ordering to paying the bill.
That makes so much sense. And it prepares you to think in English in specific situations rather than just knowing isolated words.
Let's talk about another key strategy: contextual learning. In my experience, this is absolutely essential for building vocabulary that sticks.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Learning words in meaningful contexts is so much more effective than memorizing disconnected word lists.
Exactly. I had this breakthrough moment when I was learning Spanish. I'd been struggling to remember the word sin embargo, which means however. I kept mixing it up with other transition words.
So, what changed?
I started reading a Spanish novel, and that phrase kept appearing in meaningful contexts. After seeing it used naturally about 15 times, it just stuck. I never confused it again.
That's the power of context. And it's why I always recommend learning vocabulary through materials you genuinely enjoy: books, shows, podcasts, whatever matches your interests.
Absolutely. And speaking of context, there's something I think is super important but often overlooked: collocations.
Oh, yes. Collocations are word partnerships, words that naturally go together in English, like heavy rain, not strong rain, or make a decision, not do a decision.
Exactly. And knowing these partnerships is crucial for natural sounding English. It's not enough to know individual words, you need to know how they play together.
And those collocations are actually a huge part of thinking in English. When words automatically trigger their common partners, your thinking becomes more fluid and native-like.
Right. So instead of learning the word decision in isolation, learn phrases like make a decision, tough decision, split second decision, informed decision.
I find stories are also amazing for cementing these word relationships. Our brains are wired for narrative, so vocabulary learned through stories tends to stick better.
Definitely. Even creating your own silly stories can help. I remember teaching the word procrastinate to a student who kept forgetting it, so we made up this ridiculous story about a pro basketball player who was late to games because he kept procrastinating. Never forgot it after that.
I love that approach. Making vocabulary learning playful and personal makes such a difference. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about specialized vocabulary. Many of our listeners are probably learning English for specific purposes, maybe academic studies or professional advancement.
Absolutely. And developing field specific vocabulary requires some targeted strategies beyond general English learning.
The first step is actually identifying your vocabulary gaps, right? You need to know what you don't know.
Yes, I suggest a super practical approach. Try explaining a work process or academic concept in English. Record yourself or write it down, and you'll quickly discover where you're missing specialized terms.
That's brilliant. Another approach is to gather authentic materials from your field: journal articles, professional blogs, conference presentations, and highlight terms you don't know.
And there's an important distinction to make between academic English and everyday English. Academic vocabulary tends to be more Latin based and formal.
Right, like using commence instead of start or subsequently instead of later. Those small shifts make a huge difference in how professional or academic you sound.
I had a student who was a brilliant doctor in her home country, but when she moved to the US, she struggled because she knew all the complex medical terminology, but was missing the everyday language doctors use with patients.
That's such an important point. Technical vocabulary is just one piece of professional English. You also need the casual language, idioms, and phrases specific to your work culture.
Exactly. And for building that domain specific terminology, one of my favorite approaches is to find a mentor or colleague who's a native speaker in your field. They can help you with the nuances that textbooks miss.
Online communities can be great for this too. Forums, LinkedIn groups, or professional networks where people are discussing topics in your field.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of parallel texts, reading about your specialty in both your native language and English. It helps you make direct connections between concepts you already understand and their English expressions. Let's talk about something that's crucial for everyone building vocabulary retention techniques, because it's not just about learning new words, it's about remembering them.
Oh, this is so important. I've definitely had the experience of looking up the same word multiple times because it just wouldn't stick in my memory.
Me too, and that's where structured review systems come in. My absolute favorite is spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition changed my life when learning Japanese. For listeners who aren't familiar, it's a system where you review words at increasing intervals over time, right?
Exactly. So you might review a new word tomorrow, then 3 days later, then a week later, then a month later. This approach works with how our memory actually functions.
And there are great digital tools that do this automatically. Apps like Anki, Quizlet, or Memrise use spaced repetition algorithms to optimize your review schedule.
Yes, though I always like to emphasize that how you practice matters too. Active recall, testing yourself to produce the word, is much more effective than passive review.
That's such an important distinction. Looking at a flashcard and thinking, yeah, I know that's Vecking is very different from actually having to produce the word yourself.
Absolutely. And another key retention technique is using new vocabulary in multiple contexts. If you learn a new word, challenge yourself to use it in 3 completely different sentences or situations.
I love that approach. It helps cement the word's meaning and usage patterns in your mind. And it moves vocabulary from your passive knowledge to active use, which is essential for thinking in English.
Exactly. Speaking of tools, I saw this cool vocabulary app the other day that uses AI to generate example sentences based on your interests. So if you're into soccer, it'll create example sentences about soccer using your target vocabulary.
That sounds amazing. Personalization makes such a difference in retention. Do you remember what it was called?
Oh gosh, now you're testing my memory. I think it was Vocam Nexus or something similar. I'll find the link and add it to our show notes.
Perfect. And let's not forget good old-fashioned vocabulary notebooks. I still find the physical act of writing helps with memory.
Absolutely, especially if you organize them thoughtfully with examples, collocations, and maybe even little drawings or diagrams.
Now let's talk about what might be the most important transition in language learning, moving from translation to direct understanding.
Yes, this is really the heart of thinking in English, being able to connect English words directly to concepts rather than going through your native language.
Exactly. So instead of seeing a dog and thinking perro and then dog, if you're a Spanish speaker, you want to go straight from seeing the dog to thinking dog.
And that's a neural pathway that develops with practice. One technique I love for this is using English to English dictionaries rather than bilingual ones.
That's a game changer. When you look up an unfamiliar word and read its definition in English, you're training your brain to understand English through English.
Exactly. I know it's harder at first, but learners' dictionaries, like the Oxford Learners Dictionary, use simpler language in their definitions specifically for this purpose.
And this approach helps avoid another common problem, false equivalence. Sometimes a word in your native language doesn't map exactly to its supposed translation in English.
So true. Like how the Spanish word sensible actually means sensitive in English, not sensible. Those false friends can be so confusing.
Another technique I find helpful is associating English words with images or experiences rather than translations. So instead of learning the word exhilarated by translating it, think of a time you felt that way and connect the word to that feeling.
I love that approach. It creates direct neural pathways between the English word and the concept itself. Visual thinking is so powerful for vocabulary acquisition.
Absolutely. And immersive experiences help with this too, which I know we'll cover more in our next episode.
Yes, but a quick tip on that front, try to label objects in your environment directly in English. When you see your coffee mug, practice thinking mug, not the word, in your native language.
That's such a simple but effective practice. It's about creating those direct pathways bit by bit until eventually your brain defaults to English for more and more concepts.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today. Let's wrap up with some key takeaways for our listeners.
Yes. I think the most important message is that building your English thinking vocabulary is a strategic process. It's not just about learning more and more random words.
Absolutely. Focus on the most frequent 2,000 word families first, then expand into vocabulary that's relevant to your specific needs and interests.
And organize words in semantic networks rather than isolated lists. Think in concept clusters the way native speakers do.
Learn words in meaningful contexts and pay attention to collocations, those natural word partnerships that make your English sound fluent and natural.
Use a spaced repetition and active recall techniques to ensure you remember what you learn. And try digital tools that can optimize this process for you.
For specialized vocabulary, identify your specific gaps and find authentic materials from your field or profession.
And finally, work on building direct connections between English words and concepts, rather than constantly translating through your native language.
I'm so excited for next week's episode. We'll be discussing immersion strategies for the busy learner, because let's face it, most of us don't have the luxury of moving to an English-speaking country for total immersion.
Yes. We'll share practical methods to create an English-rich environment that fosters thinking in English, even with limited time and resources. We'll cover digital immersion techniques, restructuring daily habits, and creating what I call language islands in your everyday life.
It's going to be so practical and hands on. And for those of you who've been feeling that vocabulary is your biggest hurdle to thinking in English, I hope today's episode has given you some concrete strategies to move forward.
Remember, building your English thinking vocabulary is a journey, not a destination. Every new word and phrase you learn brings you one step closer to fluid, natural thinking in English.
Thanks so much for listening to episode 2 of Real Talk, Thinking in English. If you found this helpful, please share it with a friend who's also on their English learning journey.
And we'd love to hear about your vocabulary building strategies. Connect with us on social media to share what's working for you. Until next week, happy English thinking.